J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. In this episode, I want to ask a simple question. Is it possible to be a Christian and serve as a police officer? Now, I realize that you're probably thinking, well, you must think that's true, Jim, because you kind of did that. But for the first almost 10 years of my career, I was not a Christian. And I get this question repeatedly from people online. As a matter of fact, today, I got two questions, one on Instagram and one by email, asking this question. Young Christians who are getting ready to become police officers who are wondering, is this possible? Is it possible for me to be a Christian and do that job that all my friends tell me that, oh, if you do that job, you're going to end up abandoning some of your Christian principles? That's fascinating to me, and that's what I want to talk about in this episode of our podcast. If not for you, because maybe you're not trying to become a police officer, maybe that's not your thing. But if you're considering right now the role that law enforcement plays in culture, I think this is actually an important question, because not only do I think it's possible, I think that Christianity can inform the law enforcement community in such a way that they can help us to do our jobs better, both as investigators and as law enforcement officers in the field. Remember that I was a detective for years, but detectives are not, we don't just come out of the academy and become detectives. All detectives who are working homicides at municipal agencies all began their career as patrol officers. So when people tell me all the time, they'll ask the question, well, how do I become a detective? I really want to investigate murders like you do. Well, do you want to handle domestic violence calls and bar fights and every other kind of call you're going to handle as a patrol officer? Because you might do that for 10 years before anyone gives you the opportunity to work as an investigator in that particular assignment. Detectives are simply police officers that at one time were in uniform, and now they've kind of shifted into the coats and ties and all of that. So detectives like myself, we started off our careers as police officers, and my career was similarly started off that way. I was a police officer. So if you look at all the my background before I became a detective, you will find that I was wearing a uniform for the most part. Okay. So is it possible to hold to a Christian? Now, here's why I think the question comes up at all. Because there's a sense, which I think is interesting, that police officers behave in such a way that they could not hold to Christian values and do the job. Isn't that interesting? There's a sense, because the kind of hidden question below the question, or the hidden assumption below the question, is that law enforcement officers are constantly behaving in a way that is not consistent with the Christian worldview. And if you become a police officer and you were a Christian prior, you will eventually abandon your Christian worldview, because apparently there's something about law enforcement that is innately evil that will cause you to abandon your Christian worldview. That's the underlying assumption to a question like this. And that's really the question that I get over and over again is, hey, my friend, even the one I got today, my friends and family tell me that I'm going to end up abandoning my Christian principles, and that today this question was, or statement was, that my friends tell me that I will have to do things that I would not otherwise do as a Christian. Really? Really? Okay, so let's talk about that in this. The two things. Yes, will law enforcement have an impact on your Christian worldview? Will it cause you to think about the situations in front of you and view them through the lens of your Christian worldview? Yes. But do you really think that law enforcement officers are out there on a daily basis doing things that violate a Christian worldview? Well, I can tell you that I wasn't a Christian for the first 8 or 9 years that I was a police officer. But then I was a Christian for the remaining almost 2 decades. Okay, so it's possible to have both of things in view. And not only was I a Christian, I was the kind of Christian that was on fire. I didn't become a Christian until I was 35. So I was on fire to know what is true and to live it out in a way that would actually proclaim Jesus to the people in my world, to the people around me, both police officers and suspects, right? I wanted them to see what had so impacted me, what was so important to me. But that's true for all of us. We share what we think is important with the people around us. If you're just geeked out on sports or you're geeked out on something, you have a tendency to talk about it. And I was doing that as a Christian, as a police officer, as a Christian, and I did not see my behavior change. It's not like I stopped, like I suddenly couldn't do the job because I became a Christian. In fact, I just now could articulate why certain things were important because I now had a better understanding from a Christian worldview, the ancient nature of some of the moral principles that I had been employing for years without really being able to ground them in anything. Now I was able to ground them in the ancient traditions of Christianity because the teachings of Christianity were consistent with what I experienced in the world. I always love to say it this way: the Bible describes the world the way it actually is. And I saw that as I became a Christian, and I realized, wow, all this stuff that I have been observing, the three motives for any misbehavior, the fallen nature of humans, so much of what I had been observing as a detective had been explained thousands of years earlier by the gospel authors and by the writers of the letters in the New Testament. So, let me say in this first section of our podcast today, of our broadcast today, that the biggest question I think that most young people have is about the role of Christian pacifism. Now, we're going to do a couple of episodes of our broadcast just on that issue. So I'm not going to go into all the nuts and bolts. But I think one of the biggest underlying questions is, well, look, if I'm a Christian, don't I have to embrace a pacifist view? I mean, can I use deadly force? Murder is, what if I have to discharge my weapon? What if somebody dies as a part of what if I cause somebody to die? Isn't murder something that's prohibited? I mean, how can you be involved as a murderer from a Christian perspective? Wouldn't your Christian worldview tell you that you could not level deadly force against somebody else? Well, remember that there's a big difference between murder and killing somebody. Killing somebody is to cause someone's death. Murder is the unjustified killing. Unjustified. Yeah, it turns out that we do not outlaw killing. We outlaw murder in the United States. In my state, California, is very similar to the other states. There are exceptions. You can kill somebody, and if it falls under these exceptions, you will not be charged with murder because you lack the evil intent that must be. In other words, you have some justification. What are the justifications? Well, there are two in California, two explicitly from the point of view of citizens. If somebody is trying to kill you, you can use whatever force is necessary to prevent your own death, to stop the attack on you, up to and including deadly force. So you can use whatever force is necessary to repel an attack that is in jeopardy of taking your life. If someone breaks into your house and has got a gun at your head and you end up shooting or tackling them and the gun goes off and they die, this is a killing, but it's not a murder. Because it's a justified killing, because the first justification for killing somebody is that you are simply trying to keep them from killing you. So to protect yourself. Now, where does that come from? We'll talk about that in future broadcasts, but that is a biblical concept from the Old Testament. So the exception for murder that defines it only as killing, as justified homicide, a justified homicide, the kind of homicide that you would never be adjudicated for. You would never be charged with murder if you were simply trying to defend yourself. So that's the first one. Two, the second justification for killing is that if you are trying to save the life of an innocent. So if you're in a situation where you see that somebody is innocently being attacked and is going to die as a result of the attack, you can use whatever force is necessary, up to and including deadly force, to stop the attack on the innocent. Well, that's another Old Testament principle, and we'll talk about where that comes from in a future broadcast. But I'll tell you that those two justifications for homicide are what are really they are described, and that's what allows police officers to use this level of force to protect themselves and to stop the killing of an innocent, to protect the lives of the innocent. So, for example, if somebody's a sniper and they're shooting kids in a schoolyard, police officers, if they took the life of that sniper before he shot the 7th kid, well, that would not be considered a murder. That would be considered a justified homicide based on both the law in the state of California, which is grounded thousands of years ago in the Judaic law of the Old Testament. I'll show you where that is when we do our broadcast on pacifism and is there ever a use for deadly force. We'll do all of that in the next several broadcasts. But just for now, those two things are what inform those of us who are Christians, who are police officers. I think a lot of the time the question is, well, how could I be a police officer and use deadly force? Well, wasn't Jesus a pacifist? Well, it turns out the Old Testament law that Jesus said he was not coming to destroy, but instead to embody, gives you two exceptions for when you can use deadly force. And those are in the protection of yourself and in the protection of an innocent. And if you'll see, this is why, and I guess really tricky, right? Because when you see somebody who's working in a law enforcement capacity and they use the deadly force, you have to be able to understand whether or not, is it a righteous use of deadly force? Is it a justified killing? Well, it's only going to be justified if that officer felt like he was doing one of those two things, protecting his own life or protecting the life of an innocent. And I think that's typically what you see happen. This is why you see a justified killing of somebody who's in custody, or a killing of somebody who's not in custody but trying to escape, or a killing of somebody who's trying to be detained. The officer has to be in a position, as a Christian at least, and this is also true for those who are not Christians, of believing that his life was in danger or her life was in danger, or that if this person was to escape, there was an immediate threat on an innocent if I allow that person to escape. And this is the kind, now look, by the way, we can decide as a culture if those two things no longer justify the killing of people. If we said, look, there's nothing in any circumstance would ever justify anyone being killed, then therefore, we can make a decision about that as a culture and change the laws so that if someone breaks into your house and tries to kill you, you don't even have a right to defend yourself. Or you could say, hey, I don't have a right to defend the life of a youngster, of a child. We could change the law. But right now, as the law stands, even citizens would not be prosecuted for murder under those two conditions. If you hold those two values as a Christian, well, guess what? You can still do the work of law enforcement employing those two biblical principles. In other words, at least the use of deadly force should not be the thing that becomes an obstacle for you, that you think, well, I can't be a Christian and be a police officer because I have some issue with use of force. Now, look, is there a rich tradition of Christian pacifism? Yes. And I'm not really here to argue with people who hold to that tradition. I want to respect their views. In the end, we'll all stand before God with doing the best we can to interpret what Scripture says about this issue. And I get it. To be honest, some of us, we might miss it. I might be misinterpreting it. I'm going to do my best, though, to try to interpret the passages of Scripture that inform us in these areas. If you're somebody who holds to a pacifist position, well then yeah. Can you be a Christian pacifist and be a police officer? I don't see how you could. Because the role we take as police officers at some point is going to cause us to try to put somebody into custody. If you want us to arrest wrongdoers, well, I'll be honest with you, maybe half of those will go easily, some of those will not go easily. Some of those will have to use force in order to take someone into custody, and that's where things go crazy. So if you really hold to a position that I could never use force that could rise to the level of deadly force, even to protect myself or the officer who's standing next to me, well then probably you're not going to be able to do this job. But if you hold a position that Christians have times in which force is justified, well, then you can do this job as a police officer. Let's take a break. I want to just talk about one of the biggest downfalls, one of the things you have to kind of protect yourself against if you are a Christian and you decide to become a police officer.
Need a speaker for your next conference, retreat, training seminar, or church service? Jim travels around the country, making the case for the existence of God, the deity of Jesus, and the reliability of the Bible. He'd love to partner with you to create a powerful, transformational training experience. Just visit the Cold-Case Christianity website and click the Book Me tab. You'll find everything you need to know there, including a list of Jim's speaking topics, promotional materials, Jim's speaking calendar, and a link to connect with our team so we can book your event.
Okay, now let's talk about some of the pitfalls. I mean, is it possible to be a Christian and be a police officer? Yes. Will it be easy? No. There will be things that will be difficult for you. Not because there's some sense in which, it's not as though Christians go out every day or police officers go out every day and they violate a moral code repeatedly. And therefore, if you're a Christian who holds to a high moral standard, you can never do this job because police officers are constantly violating a moral standard. That is not the case. But I will tell you that if you do this job consistently, it'll have an effect on you. And one of the largest effects it'll have, and I could probably do 10 episodes on just the impact that law enforcement has on humans, male or female, wherever you may be, whatever you may believe, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, law enforcement will wear on you. Doing this job wears on you. Why? Because it forces you into the unrealistic, actually not unrealistic, but the very narrow view of humans that's not normal for us. Most of us, when we think of our neighbors, we think of them very broadly. We don't think of them narrowly as a bunch of, in other words, we get exposed. If you weren't a law enforcement officer and you drive down your street, you're going to pass 30 houses, of which you kind of know those people. You bumped into them at games, you bumped into them at raising your kids at the schools, you see them on the street when they're outside in their front yard, you talk to them, but you don't see the underbelly of their relationships, what their difficulties are in their marriage. You don't see when they are fighting. You don't see, well, if you're a police officer, that's all you're going to see. You're only going to get called to that aspect, that narrow view of even your own community, right? So if I'm not a police officer, I walk through Trader Joe's or through, Target or whatever your favorite, Walmart, whatever your favorite place is, and you just have an open mind about everyone. If you're a police officer, it's like all you see are all the problems you've been looking at because you only get called to these problems. And at some point, you look at these houses you get called to, they look very, very normal from the outside, but you enter behind those doors and you realize what a terrible situation is really going on behind the door. They look normal. They present themselves to the community as loving families, but you see all the conflict and all the problems that occur in every single community. And you start to wonder, is that happening behind every door that looks normal? Is that happening behind every... So it starts to twist your view of humans. And let me tell you what you do to survive that. Also, if you're going to go to the murder scene of some little girl who's been brutally murdered, and not only is it horrific to look at, but if you think about it, I mean, what did this girl do to ever deserve this treatment? These are these aren't even victims who put themselves in harm's way. These are just people who were just plucked out by some killer who decided that that's my target today. I'm going to tell you, if you do enough of those cases, you have to start to build in defense mechanisms. And here's one of the most common defense mechanisms you will build in. And I talk about this all the time with officers. Not much, I don't think, on this broadcast. And that is that you have to kind of rein in and create a very narrow circle of the people for whom you are willing to cry about. In other words, I have a circle of people that I am willing to cry about, and it is very small. Because I'll tell you, if that little girl who I'm now at that crime scene and I'm looking at her body and I'm thinking, well, she's in my circle, she's somebody I'm willing to cry about, I'm not going to be able to do my job today. No, she's outside my circle. There are some people who are outside my circle. And to be honest, as you do this job longer and longer, especially if you're a homicide detective, pretty much everyone's outside your circle except for your immediate family, your spouse, your kids. I always say that my dog is inside my circle of people I'm willing to, or of beings that I'm willing to cry about. My cat is not inside my circle, okay? So maybe your cat would be. But my point is, you start to kind of drill down and narrow in, and you create a small circle of people for whom you are willing to cry. And everyone else is outside that circle. Therefore, I can work those cases and not get hung up. I won't bring it home. I won't talk about it off duty. I won't think about it off duty. I won't get... It won't even cross my mind the minute I leave the crime scene. And that's a survival mechanism. And for years I did that. And I ratcheted down that circle and made it so tight that there was almost nobody outside my immediate family that was outside. I hate to say that, but I could work my best friend's murder and not flinch because that's the circle thing. Sorry. That's how you survive in a job like this. And I suspect there's a lot of police officers out there who are listening to this right now who probably feel the same way. They have ratcheted down. Now, if they haven't, then they're suffering. And they're suffering and struggling right now because they haven't narrowed this. Now, for me, I never had a problem working the worst cases. Because give them to me. I'll be happy to work them. Why? Because I'd already done this, and this is now just my family, so I'm good. I can handle all that. Now, here's the problem with that as a Christian. Christianity calls us, Jesus calls us, to open the circle. We can't have some circle let me tell you what you lack. When you draw this circle tight, let me tell you what's missing. Empathy is missing. Empathy is missing. Because I'm like, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to imagine myself. No, I'm not going to put myself in your shoes because I'm sorry. I got to survive all the garbage I'm going to look at in the next 12 months. I am not putting myself in your shoes. No, I'm going to work that case and I'm going to be your best advocate and I'm going to solve this case. But I am not going to cry about this case. I'm not going to be empathetic. I'm not going to even, I'm going to turn that off because I'm going to have 100 more cases just like this one. So I'm not allowing myself. Well, really? The Christian worldview says, no, Jim, you need to stop that. Jesus is calling me to open my circle. And that is a struggle. Is it possible to be a Christian and be yes. But will it take some work? Oh my goodness. It's going to be difficult at the very least. And one of the things that makes it difficult is struggling with this issue of empathy for others, because empathy would draw you in such a way that you would struggle with your own peace and joy. And let me tell you what, we get a chance to go up and work with returning veterans at Operation Heal Our Patriots, which is a Samaritan's Purse ministry. And it's an amazing ministry for wounded warriors who have come back from overseas. And they are here with their families, and they are really struggling in their marriages. And this is a marriage retreat that tries to help, number one, give you some very basic principles for marriage. How to communicate in your marriage, how to thrive in your marriage, but it's all from a Christian perspective, and it preaches the gospel. Because in the end, the gospel is the thing that changes. Look, if I didn't have Christ in my life, I would continue to wrench down this circle to the point where I would be pretty hard to live with. But what Jesus is telling me is, even on those moments where I'm like, nope, not in my circle, Jesus is saying, really? Really? Aren't you glad, Jim, that you were in my circle? Aren't you glad that I didn't have a circle mechanism in my head about who I was willing to save? Yeah. I have to remind myself of what Jesus has done for me so that I can be gracious, forgiving, and loving to others, because what I've been doing is just shutting that all off just so I can work their cases. Now, is there some pain in this? You have to trust God. It took me a long time to shift from here is the human mechanism that I have created to survive my job to what can God do for me to help me survive my job. In other words, I was always Jim dependent before I became a Christian. You become Jesus dependent the minute you do become a Christian, and there's a different way to go on that. That yes, you actually can open up your circle and you can survive it because you're giving things to God. You're giving eternal things to God. It's not on you to make the world right. It's not on you, because the world is more than just your temporal experience in the 90 years you're going to be here. All of us are eternal creatures, and in the end, God will make things right. And once you realize that, some of the pressure comes off of you, right? And you're able to better navigate the world around you. But I will tell you, the two things that I think are stumbling points is, number one, will I be able to use force appropriately? And number two, will I be able to absorb the garbage I'm going to be looking at and not be forever affected by it, not be forever... Finally, the thing that I think is transformative about being a Christian is not only can Christians be police officers, but I hope that every police officer becomes a Christian. I hope that every police officer becomes, because it turns out the stuff that we struggle with in culture, forget about law enforcement, is answered, is solved by the gospel. If you think that there's an issue about race related to police work, the gospel solves that, addresses that issue, solves that issue. Who you are, regardless of your color, your position, the uniform you wear or don't wear, that's addressed by the gospel. The gospel addresses all of this. We are not white or black beings. We are human beings in the image of God according to the scriptures. And it solves the problem. And every time, this is why people, moral reformers like Martin Luther King Jr., knew that his own rhetoric would not be enough to convince a nation. But if there was a truth that comes from God on this issue, that might convince the nation. And so in the end, I don't have to point to what I think is true about race. I need to point to what God says about us as image bearers. So in the end, it turns out that the gospel and the truth that's proclaimed in Scripture, remember, Scripture describes the world the way it really is, that stuff actually addresses whatever it is that's happening in culture and whatever it is you might be struggling with as a police officer. As a matter of fact, before I close this session with you guys today, I want to point you to a brand new project. We've been spending a lot of time at coldcasechristianity.com describing, taking a kind of a police and detective view and applying it to Christianity. We're going to flip that script at thethinbluelife.com. Thethinbluelife.com. We are basically taking a Christian view of law enforcement. And you take a Christian view. And do you think you can't do this job with excellence as a Christian? Well, the best years I had in my career were all post my conversion. All the cold cases I solved after becoming a Christian. I worked cold cases before that, but I only started solving, not because of my Christian view, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is, it's not impossible. Now, I wasn't a patrol officer as a Christian, but my son was for 10 years. Trust me, you can do this job as a Christian, as somebody who's not just a Christian, but as a vocal Christian. And I want to encourage you, if you are thinking about law enforcement, we need more Christ followers in the profession. So yes, you can be a Christian and a police officer. As a matter of fact, I would encourage all of you who are police officers to become Christians. Hope this is helpful. I'll see you next week right here at Cold Case Christianity.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.